Nice.
Hi, I'm Olivia, and thank you for coming to Sustainable Fashion Week today. This session is called Representation Matters. So we'll be talking about if we think and if we feel that sustainable fashion industry, as it is at the moment, is inclusive and accessible to marginalised voices in every sense of that term. And if it isn't, I'm not saying it isn't, if it isn't, how we think we can make that a bit better and changes we think we can make. So as I said, I'm Olivia. I am a Black and Green Ambassador in Bristol. So that's a programme that explores racial and climate justice and the intersection between them. So that's kind of my area of interest and how I'm involved with Sustainable Fashion Week. I'm joined by Sam and Ellie, who will be talking more about what they do today. And I have a little intro for each of them that I will read out, and then I'll let them talk a bit more about what they do, why they think representation matters. We'll chat for about half an hour-ish, but we want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers for you, so we might cut that a bit down. So start thinking of questions at the moment, because if we're talking about representation mattering, we've got to hear your voices in this conversation too. So Ellie, who's sat on the end over there, Ellie Medhurst runs a blog called Dressing Dykes. This is the only resource dedicated to the history of lesbian fashion. Ellie herself is a lesbian fashion historian, having studied her undergrad and master's in fashion history, specialising in queer subversive fashion. She's a writer, researcher and freelance lecturer, so I think all in all she's pretty awesome and I'd like to be her.
Thank you.
So that's the intro for Ellie. And also next to me is Sam Mabley, who founded both Here and Yes Friends. He's focusing more on Yes Friends now, which is an ethical and sustainable t-shirt company, and it's just $7.99, which answers that accessibility question. So they're the two voices you'll be hearing today. Thank you both for being here. And to get started, I think I'll give each of you just 5 minutes to talk a little bit more about who you are, your journey to being here today and involved in sustainable fashion, and I think most importantly, why you think what you do is important within the context of the industry as a whole. So Ellie first.
Yes, amazing. So as Olivia said, my name's Ellie. I run a blog called Dressing Dykes, which is about lesbian fashion history. But it's not just about history, because our fashion history is completely entwined with our fashion in the present and how we're moving into the future. And with fashion history, from my point of view, queer fashion histories, LGBT fashion histories are so often unseen. And often the way that this is talked about is that they're invisible, or that we can't see them, there's no records of them. But most of the time, that's not the case. It's more that people have not wanted us to research it because of, oppression, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm trying to change that language. Instead of being about being invisible, it's that we have been erased, and trying to then create our visibility from scratch anew. So that's part of what I do. But in terms of sustainability and representation, where these things entwine, part of my research recently has been about craft as a form of fashion activism, and using crafts to create clothing, to create fashion cultures, but within activism. I'm currently writing a chapter about lesbian crafted fashion, where I've been talking about things like personal screen-printed t-shirts and knitted jumpers. And I think that that's completely entwined with the idea of sustainability, because when you make something for yourself, you're sort of circumventing that fast fashion system where the garment workers are exploited, and the environment is not treated particularly fairly. So yeah, within that, I've been looking at the jumpers from Greenham Common, which you might know about. It was a group of women who came together against nuclear war and against nuclear missiles that were being stored at Greenham Common, which was in Berkshire, I believe, in the UK. And part of that activism, although the activism was immense, part of that was in knitting jumpers that had messages or symbols knitted onto them, so that these women could show their activism through the clothes that they wore and the clothes that they made. So yeah, that's part of my research and why I think some of these threads are important and how they come together. And I'll be talking more about it as we go through our questions and discussion today.
Awesome, thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question very quickly?
Yeah, of course.
So you talked about the fact that you've kind of always studied history and fashion history particularly, but is that something that's just always been interesting to you, and then bringing in the queerness as part of that, or how has that developed throughout your life? Because I can't imagine, maybe I'm wrong, I can't imagine just being 5 years old and being like, do you know what I want to be when I grow up?
So it came about, I was really interested in costume for film and for theatre. And I thought that studying fashion history would help me with that. But as I was doing my studies and as I was going through this fashion history journey, as I'm a lesbian, as I was looking into trying to look at lesbian fashion history and how I could sort of relate to that and bring it into the future or the present. And there's really not anything out there. There's one book called Queer Style. There's some articles here and there about, queer or lesbian fashion history. But there's not much out there at all. And I decided that I was going to make there be some out there. So that's why I started my blog, Dressing Dykes, because aside from it being online and free and accessible, I wanted there to just be a resource about lesbian fashion history, more broadly queer fashion history, but that's even a much bigger topic. So yeah, it was sort of me seeing that there was a gap that needed to be filled.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to ask you more questions on that later. But in the meantime, Sam, same question to you. What's your journey to being here? What more explanation on kind of what you do and how it fits within the sustainable fashion industry context, and then why you think it's important?
Cool. So as Olivia said, I'm Sam. So I got into ethical fashion probably like 8 years ago. Went shopping one day and my conscience was just like, flip, I can't buy anything that's not ethical. Just in a normal shop, I was thinking about working conditions and pay particularly. So that started the journey. And so I started looking into a lot of different ethical fashion brands and sustainable fashion brands, and then set up a store in Bristol called Found Here, which used to be at Wapping Wharf, which is just behind M Shed. So I did that for 4 years until super recently, because this year I set up a new brand called Yes Friends, which our aim is to make ethical fashion affordable, which is one of the huge barriers to accessibility in the industry generally at the moment. So we launched in April with a $7.99 sustainable and ethical t-shirt, and have sort of cracked on from there. And so we're now doing hoodies and t-shirts for Christmas and stuff, and building up. So I'm working on that.
Cool,
yeah.
Very cool. So I'm going to ask the question of, when I was looking at your website, I was like, how can it be ethical and sustainable for $7.99? Is it just that the world has told us that things need to be expensive?
Yeah.
So how are you, if that's not giving away trade secrets?
Yeah, no, how is it possible? No, it's a great question. You couldn't set up a brand and then not tell people how it's,
well,
how it's
people
done.
People do.
Yeah, so it actually came out of a sustainable fashion blog for this event.
Okay.
So one of the people on this team was interviewing me for it, and they said, I've heard it costs £30 to make a fully ethical t-shirt, and I was just like, what the heck, that's not true at all. And I think within the ethical fashion industry, you've got, it's generally targeted towards the higher price market at the moment, which is, I think there's various reasons for that, but I was just aware of brands who were like doing printed t-shirts and stuff, and the actual t-shirt was costing them £3, and then they were selling it for £30 because you were mainly paying for design. And so I knew if we could have scale, so we have a minimum order of 1,500 t-shirts. So if we had that scale and then could go direct to consumer, so essentially cut out the middleman, which was my shop previously, and go straight to the customer, then we could cut down our margins and therefore be able to do a sustainable and ethical t-shirt, $7.99.
Cool.
So to dive slightly into margins on that, for context, we pay about £3.50 for our t-shirts. And so you could buy, like wholesale, you could buy a conventional cotton t-shirt for about £1 wholesale. So it's a significant price increase on that, but it's still a relatively small price.
Awesome, awesome, very cool. So you skipped over a question there that I'm going to ask you.
Cool.
So why, and Ellie as well for input on that, so why do you think that sustainable fashion in particular, I know that everyone marks up prices for everything to make a profit, but why do you think sustainable fashion in particular has just marketed itself at that top, at that expensive price level and kind of automatically closing off a big part of its audience?
Is this for me already?
Both. Whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, you're probably more...
Okay, all right, I'll give it a go. So I think there's the current market for ethical products generally, like we've seen with food and organic and all of that kind of thing. It's because there's a bit of a price markup on it, it's tended to be towards the middle class market, and I think you can then put a little bit of price premium on it anyway because of the customers who are going and buying it. And then also if you build your brand around that, you can then brands, like you can just put prices on things because of brands basically, and mark things up because of that. And then also there's a practical thing of if your business model includes wholesale, so going through stores, you have to put an extra markup on things. So we can't, as Yes Friends, we haven't built our business around working wholesale with stores, and so. Whereas we would have to charge maybe instead of charging £8, we'd have to charge £16 for a t-shirt because if we were wanting to get the margins by going through stores.
Cool. That makes complete sense. Ellie, would you agree with that kind of?
I'm actually thinking back to something that you mentioned earlier about how there's this expectation of a higher price with ethical fashion. And I think that, as there's already this trend of ethical fashion costing more, if there's a new brand, they might feel like either, depending on their mentality, that they are able to put a higher price on something because that's the trend that's already been set, or that they have to, or maybe those same consumers won't think that it's the sort of thing they're going for because it doesn't match with the other things, the other sustainable products on the market. But obviously that keeps it very much within that sort of middle class consumer base and
doesn't
draw new people in. So I think that might be
definitely.
too.
I would agree with that too. So a question for you both again. Do you think the sustainable, ethical, I kind of hate using sustainable and ethical, so I'm going to do considered and conscious fashion industry.
Great.
Because I feel like they've been co-opted and greenwashed. Whatever we want to call it, movement, fashion industry, as it stands now, is inclusive and accessible? As that world is now, do you think it is? Ellie first.
I think that the sustainable fashion world is more inclusive than the unsustainable fashion world in general. I think that there's it's more conscious, to use the word that you just used. It's more conscious of people because to be sustainable, you have to be conscious of the garment workers, every person in the production line, or you're not being sustainable at all. So if you've got that consciousness, you're more likely to be conscious towards other people within the fashion industry as well. Not that this is always the case, but it's more likely to be true. But I think there are still big issues. I know there have been issues with sustainable brands not being size inclusive, for one thing, not having people from different marginalizations, not having people of color, not having LGBT people included, not just in campaigns and imagery, but within their shops and their sorts of hierarchy. So it's something that people don't always think about first and foremost, but every person in that production line and in that in the sustainable fashion system has to still be included and represented, no matter who they are or why they might have been excluded in the first place. So I think it's better than some other areas of fashion, but I think there's still quite a long way to go.
Nice.
Sam?
I think that's a great answer. Solid. So yeah, haven't got much to add to that really. Apart from I think broadly it's like where it's for the UK consumer, I think it's an incredibly uninclusive market. As I hammer on about the affordability point, but it's like it isn't affordable. And then, but going along with that, there's not a big enough range of. Just because the market's quite small at the moment and it's emerging, there's not enough brands at the moment to cater to different audiences and styles. And so I think as we see the market grow, we'll see more brands grow. And so we'll start to hit both the design and the pricing, which will then open it up to a more inclusive consumer market.
Going off of that though, I just wanted to say about the versatility of the actual garments designed is that it's not inclusive because it doesn't represent the clothes that everyone wants to wear. Some people, there's quite, you know, every day, not every day, but every brand that appears, a sustainable brand, might be offering something new, but there's still a lot of design features that maybe aren't featured in a lot of sustainable clothing brands, which is why people then go to fast fashion instead, because they're looking for a specific garment or a trend that they've seen online that has been produced very quickly within fast fashion and hasn't then been reflected in sustainable fashion. So I think it's about this sort of representation of what people want to wear as well, or they won't go to it.
I think with that, you've got to have there's got to be a mix of brands coming along and doing things which are new and interesting, but also then a mass cultural change, which is the really, really hard thing of changing from a fashion season, which is 52 weeks a year, as opposed to like 4 seasons when we had before. And how can we, like, as a sustainable fashion brand, you have, like, it's really tricky in the design world because nobody's going to keep up with the
micro trends.
Totally.
Every minute.
And so that is like the eternally difficult question of how do you create mass cultural change towards less consumerism.
Yeah.
Any pictures for how you do that?
I haven't got any ideas. You guys got any ideas?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
Okay, that all makes complete sense. I'm thinking of too many questions in my head as you're talking. But one thing I am going to say is my big thing with Black and Green is about kind of celebrating cultural heritage and things that all, you know, marginalised voices, I particularly talk about kind of race and diversity within that, already do. And I think fashion is a big one because you don't see traditional African dress, traditional Indian dress celebrated in sustainable fashion necessarily in that industry. And a lot of those cultures and that heritage is inherently sustainable, you know, to coin a Western term. Because of the way those cultures live and the way that heritage has been passed down. So I think that's definitely something that's missing. Is it feels like you have to be a new brand or a new thing to be labelled as sustainable and ethical fashion, whereas there's a lot of stuff going on already, has done, always will done, still going to happen because people want to dress themselves. That could just be brought up within that phrase, and it's doing its thing really well. So that was a point I wanted to make as opposed to a question I wanted to ask.
Good point.
And then the question I wanted to ask was, we've been saying representation, and the session is called Representation Matters. But I feel like representation is just the beginning because it can feel a little bit like tokenism. So if we can flip more into accessibility, and you mentioned not just kind of seeing people as models, but seeing them behind all things. So do you think that the kind of behind the scenes world of sustainable fashion is accessible to people, to all different types of people? Or a flip question is, if we say start with representation, what do you think is the next step after that?
And by the behind the scenes world, do you mean sort of like the recruitment space and all of that kind of thing?
I mean the design, I mean, obviously there tend to be a larger majority of kind of lower socioeconomic income and people of colour in the production line of things. But I'm talking about the managerial positions, I'm talking about, if I say that representation is just about being a model, everything else that goes on in the other bits is sustainable fashion. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, sorry, and then say the final bit of the question again.
I don't know what the final bit
was. Was it then, what's the next step?
Yeah.
Okay.
If representation is the first step, what's the next step after that to make sustainable fashion better?
Better. Great. You got any thoughts for us?
Well, maybe it's still forming in the back of my head, but the first thing that comes to mind is that, like you said, with modelling and campaigns, people begin to be represented first because, or a lot of the time they do, because it gives that brand the image that they are inclusive. And they are being inclusive to an extent because it gives queer, people of colour, disabled models an opportunity, hopefully a paid opportunity, and an opportunity to have not just a job, but to see themselves represented. But as you said, sometimes that can lead to tokenism. Sometimes that means that people aren't necessarily being paid as much for their work because maybe it's like a one-time event that they get brought in for. So for it to change, I'm not sure how to answer the question of how to make representation just the norm within the whole of sustainable fashion and behind the scenes and stuff like that. But I think it comes with bringing people in consistently, not just bringing people in for one thing, for one consultation or one photo shoot or one whatever it might be, but to keep them coming in to have like they do every other photo shoot, or they come and consult once a month or twice a year or something like that, rather than it just being a one-time thing. They get their money, they go, and they're looking for the next thing that they can do to get them a paycheck and to get them represented. So it needs to be about consistency rather than just one-time representation, I think.
Totally. I'd agree with all of that. I think recruitment is the, like, because the people of your business are the heart of your business and everything will grow out of that place, your recruitment process, I think, is really important to think about that, of who are you building around your team at different levels as well. And I think that goes right through to the factory as well. There was a report released last year, which was looking at wages in supply chains, particularly looking at European clothing factories, and they lots of things were said in the report, but one of them was about how the gender proportion was just all off. So there was loads of women who were sewing, and then there was loads of men in management, and naturally you're then going to get a imbalanced hierarchy, and it's not going to, and you're not going to have good representation of those women in management, and therefore, I think looking at all of those kind of things of recruitment, hierarchy, who you've got in different levels within your business is really, really important, because then I think that naturally stems out to advertising and what your front-facing looks like of the business.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you. So I think we've touched on tokenism and kind of the image of stuff. So what do you think makes a sustainable fashion brand authentic? How do you go beyond that?
How do you make them authentic? I think that's a really, really hard question, because it's like, how do you, taking not a sustainable fashion brand, but taking Nike, looking at...
Should you be dropping names of unsustainable
fashion brands? But I think it's an example of a brand who will put out ads where you'll be like, they'll have a real emotional connection with the audience because they're amazing marketers. And so in that you can be like, oh, they really care about Black Lives Matter, or they really care about the athletes they work with, or whatever, and they have these ads of find your greatness and all of this kind of stuff, and you watch them and you're like, yes, I need to find my greatness and stuff. But then in reality, if you look at their supply chains, you're like, hang on, how is that possibly matching down there? And so I think it's, but I can't say the agency who made that ad, like, they didn't have some sort of good heart behind it, you know. And so it's so hard to, I think, because they have such an emotional connection, these ads, you then got to go into your rational part of your brain and go, hey, but I heard this case study about Nike and this part of their supply chain, and it's really hard to then, I think it's really hard to make a judgment call without looking at the whole thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense. So I'm going to flip that question then, and this still goes for you as well, Ellie. How do you make your brand authentic?
So I think that is then about it being, I think it then comes down to recruitment of who we're bringing on board our team. And so when there was a group of 5 of us who set it up, and so for us, and I'm really aware that we've got 3 guys who are like main guys on the team, and 2 of us are white, 1's Korean, and then so we were thinking, okay, we need more freelancers. Who are we getting on as freelancers? When they come in, they have to be women, they have to be people of colour, they have to, like, we've got to try and build a diverse team as much as possible, because otherwise we're just gonna keep on, whether we try to or not, everyone just reflects their own bias like all the time. So I'm aware that naturally I'll reflect that bias. So how can I make sure that doesn't happen? And like from a commercial perspective, it makes sense. Like it's stupid not to do it. Cool.
Ellie, authenticity then, thoughts?
I think you always have to be conscious of it, because otherwise, like you were saying, if you've got a bias, if you're not consistently trying to be conscious of it, then you're just going to forget about it, because if you're a privileged person, then it doesn't necessarily matter to you. So you need to actively be looking for people who, I'm not going to say are less privileged, because that's not necessarily the case, but who are not represented in whichever environment it may be. But I was thinking it's also a lot about transparency, as you were saying, with the supply chains versus the marketing. That information needs to be available. It can't just be like a case study that someone has managed to do in some situation. It needs to consistently be available. Who is being employed, what kinds of people are being employed, how much are they being paid, is one kind of person being paid more than another kind of person throughout the supply chain, not just at the top, but all the way to garment workers, because there are so many steps in between, and we need to know the realities of what's happening there rather than just seeing the marketing and that's it, because otherwise, you get a one-sided image.
Brilliant. Well, not brilliant, because it's all awful, but brilliant answers. So I've got a question for you specifically, Ellie, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So when talking about diversity and inclusion and all that EDI kind of stuff, a lot of people's minds instantly go to gender and race, just because I think they're more at the forefront at the moment with particular things. But obviously you're focusing particularly on queerness. So what do you think is unique in trying to bring queerness into conversations around sustainability broadly, fashion, and if you kind of want to talk about particular barriers or stories of inspiration and success around that?
Okay, so something that comes to mind is that various queer fashion cultures within fashion history have been sustainable just on their own merit. If you look at like drag balls as shown in TV shows like Pose, which you might have seen, or, it's the precursor to things like RuPaul's Drag Race. People who put those outfits together were doing it with what they could find, with bits of material, with leftover garments. And queer fashion in that way has this long legacy of sustainability, as I was talking about earlier, things like activist fashion, where people are knitting their own garments or they're screen printing their own T-shirts. That is another legacy of sustainability. So it's that queer fashion within sustainable fashion, it's not like we're just coming in, it's that we've always been there, and our histories and our opinions need to have a voice. I think also, as we're looking at now, so many queer people within the fashion industry are working as models, because that's starting to become something that's fashionable and accepted, and people want to bring these people in. I know that there are non-binary models who are being put in the spotlight when they haven't before, but even then, like I said earlier, they need to be paid properly, they need to have repeat opportunities, and they need to be represented like for who they are rather than in a tokenistic way. And these are ideas that come up again and again.
Brilliant. Did you have something to add there, Sam? Sorry, I interrupted you. Cool. So I suppose my next question will be around championing diversity. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes and there's so many questions I could ask. Championing diversity. So how championing diversity and inclusion, how do we do that? And are there particular brands or collectives or groups that you would say are doing this well at the moment?
For me, I'm coming from a different perspective because I don't work within the sustainable fashion industry. It's just something that's related to me. But when I look at things that are sort of about fashion and fashion research, I've got a little list of resources that I'm just going to refer to just in case I forget anything, because I'm very prepared for today. There's things like the Fashion and Race Database, which is a really amazing resource, which is trying to put racial fashion on the map and trying to represent people of colour within the fashion industry and within fashion history, fashion present and futures. So that's the Fashion and Race Database, and that's really amazing. It has like free articles online, and it's got like links to books that are about different minorities within fashion. So that's one organisation that is really important, I think, and other just small organisations and groups and people around who are really trying to make a difference. There's also Common Threads Press, which is they do a zine and they do a newsletter about, it's related to sustainable fashion, but it's about craft and craft within queer culture sometimes, and minority craft practices. And that's really amazing. So that's Common Threads Press. And Decorating Dissidents is a website that has it's a whole variety of sources about craft practices historically and now. It's got interviews with artists and stuff like that about their sustainable craft practices. So it's a little bit off of what you were asking, but it's more related to like the things that I look at personally.
I'm actually going to really cheekily, before Sam answers that question, ask a question to you.
Yes.
So you, as a historian, you talk a lot and you've spoken a lot about history and how that influences the past, present and the future. I think within sustainability broadly, there's this idea that we just need to go back to how it was in, I don't know, 1960, 1920. And as my brother likes to remind me every time I romanticise the past, he says, everyone was much more racist then, Olivia. You do realise this. So what do you think that is true? We just need to go back to make, do and mend mentality? Or do you think there is this hybrid version of embracing the technology and the industrialisation and the forward progress, if you want to call it that, whilst taking the best parts of history?
Yeah, I think it's more that we have to meld the two rather than just going back to how we were, because I don't think that we can go back to the past. And I think that also in the past, over 100 years ago, clothing was one of the most expensive things in someone's life. That was one of the biggest financial things. Was spending money on clothes, on new coats, on new shoes. And now that's not necessarily the case, but it definitely was for hundreds and hundreds of years that clothing was very expensive. And I don't think that we're ever going to go back to that. It proves how much labor is put into the making of clothing and how much these materials cost and should cost when they're not being super, super, super mass manufactured. But I don't think that most of the population of the world would want to go back to that, because we've got used to having more clothes and being able to have them more accessibly. But that doesn't mean that we need to have clothes all the time, like how so many people do. They go to a high street store and buy out the whole thing and wear everything once. Especially because there are already so many clothes in the world. There's so many clothes in charity shops and vintage shops, but even things that don't get sold in those charity shops then go over to other countries and try and get sold there. And half the time they're not even wanted there, and then they go to a scrap heap. So there's more than enough clothes to carry on. And if the clothes are ripped or broken in some way, then that fabric can be recycled. And that's things people are moving towards doing. But it's not necessarily going back to how we were, but using these garments that are already in the world to create something new is, I think, a really important thing to do.
Brilliant. Sorry, I will let you talk in a minute.
No, great. You carry on.
Just a point I wanted to make on that is I think we are better at acknowledging the incoming part of the supply chain now. So there is not enough space for garment workers and the kind of the lower rung of that chain. But we're better at acknowledging that, and there's more of a focus within the broader sustainability conversation around making those ethical conditions better. But as with everything, we kind of try and recycle it, or wish cycle it, as I call it, and then kind of forget about the impact that the clothes have at the end of their life. And it again feeds into that, you don't see piles of clothes in Europe left on the street or being burnt or contributing to pollution in lots of different ways. So I think that's another thing we've got to consider in kind of the inclusivity piece is the waste that is generated. You're extracting it, may that be labour or resources from the global south. You're using it for a week and then you're dumping it back. So I think that's another thing you've got to consider in the cycle. We're better at the front end, but we're not so good at the back end yet. But sorry, Sam, back to
No,
to me on
great.
my soapbox for a second.
You're doing great.
Championing diversity, who do you think is doing it? How do we do that well? And do you have any people who you'd recommend?
Recommend are doing it well. So I think the three areas you need to look at or 3 areas you can look at for championing diversity are product, advertising, and recruitment. So product would be everything from price of product to design of product, and being like, is that catering for a diverse range of people? And then advertising is like, you can slate brands for, like I did earlier with Nike, for doing an outward show of diversity. But I think it's a really obvious place where you can be like, how can we make it a really inclusive place with who we're showing in our advertising? And then I think ideally that comes from recruitment. And so you've got a team who you then reflect them in your advertising. And so it comes from, and that's how you create it authentically. It comes from that place of, we've got this team who's then represented through everything we do. So I think those are the 3 areas you can champion diversity. Brands who do it well, I think Lucy and Yak are doing a pretty good job.
My skirt and my jacket is Lucy and Yak.
Nice.
Just a little plug.
Yeah, and I think they're doing well on lots of levels, really. On probably all of them, product, advertising, and I don't know anything about the recruitment process, but you'd hope that it was. Yeah, you'd hope it good. So yeah, Lucy and Yak. Who else? I've seen Good On You produce some good articles. So if you don't know that organisation, they are a app who. They're an ethical clothing directory. So if you want to know if a brand is ethical, you go on Good On You and you type in the name of that brand, and then it will give you a rating. But they also have a blog and release lots of great content. So I would recommend looking at them as well.
Brilliant. I've got one more question for you guys, and then we're going to open up to the floor. So have your questions ready. So I was going to say my champion of diversity is a local one. It's Serena Sadiq, who runs Smart Squid, and she prints on ethical. She's the one who put me onto conscious and considered clothing, so she prints on reused stuff and ethical bits, and she screen prints it all herself. And she's about getting people into nature as well, so it's all about teaching through her fashion around biodiversity and the environment, and then her profits go back into creating a magazine that is given to low-income school children around the southwest to again engage them in nature. So that's my one of, she's doing sustainable fashion and ethical business very well.
Nice.
So my last question for you guys is, what would be the one thing you would tell the sustainable fashion industry that they need to do to go beyond the place they are now and create space for everyone within their business? Just one thing.
One thing.
For me, from my point of view, I would say that they have to consider the past as well as the future, that there are clothes that already exist, that there are histories within various communities that already have a long relationship with sustainable fashion, and that we need to think about the resources that we already have and the people that we can reach out to and the clothes that can be remade or reworn before we necessarily power forward into the future. We need to take those resources that we have and use them. Yeah.
Nice.
Cool.
I would go down the recruitment route, as I've said loads of
couldn't have
times.
guessed that.
Yeah, and I think it would be looking at your current community and going, who's not included in my current community, and therefore who am I missing out in the recruitment process, and how do I reach out to different groups of people through the brand? And I've also got a recommendation for everyone for diversity, championing diversity,
Yes.
which is I really recommend emailing brands and messaging them on Instagram if you see an area of their business where you're like, I think this should improve, because brands do read messages and they do just respond to consumer demand. So if they're getting lots of messages from people, I think it will help to produce a change.
Awesome. People power. I like it. Cool. So, any questions from you guys? I think that's the most important bit. No? There's got to be one. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Question like comment type thing, thank you. So I just got to say that as a person of colour working in sustainable fashion, there's lots of like gatekeeping by white individuals and companies and organisations who are. I'm surprised to hear Lucy and Yappy did on you as like mentions of examples of diversity as talking of so Lucy and Yappy, great company, but I wouldn't say this is an area in which they excel. It's an area that they have had to be incredibly like forced to navigate in, and needed a social media kind of outrage to act upon. And what that I think the minimum that should describe to us as consumers, as critical thinkers, is that if decision makers can't guide themselves, then they should also be rewarded for like the final outcome of their work. Does that make sense? So like, great that they've adapted. A lot of organisations are adapting. Like, great that organisations are adapting. But I think it's really important that we don't hold them as leaders in the space, because otherwise we're waiting on their own parameters for change, which I think already illustrated to us are limited. And I think, you mentioned them, I think they're a really great example of that actually. But there are many others as well, of course. And yeah, so I just think it's really important to note that, because it's very easy to see organisations do the minimum and be like, those are the leaders, and then everyone around them looks to them to see what path they should be going on. And in the meantime, the people who have actually driven the change, who tend to be people of colour behind the scenes, are initially just marginalised, and they're not rewarded in the same way. Like, this is how I think the normalisation of whiteness can actually assess that.
Brilliant. No, I completely agree. So I suppose, can I ask you a question then? In the flip side of that, who would your recommendation be for championing diversity? A brand that does it well and has kind of not necessarily been forced to change, because people grow and organisations grow and change, and they're going to do that if they're going to be better. But who would your better than Lucy and Yak be, who hasn't had to have that criticism?
So, the slightly embarrassing thing is that I'm a brand owner.
So that's absolutely fine. Okay.
The next session which is focused around people.
I was actually just about to plug the next session, so that's perfect.
Kind of put to the side. I would say like what I look for is like ownership and like historical precedents. Like brands like Nana, who are really championing Asian brands and manufacturers. And to be honest, I don't know a direct answer for you, but I do feel that sustainable fashion is like being kept by.
Completely agree. Completely agree. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
I've got a question for Ellie. What are your thoughts on kind of big companies who will take on the kind of gay pride thing for Gay Pride Month? And it's nice because for people in lower income things, they can have things, not necessarily that proud flag on the top is what you want to represent yourself, but do you think that it's a positive that they are open to this kind of pushing it out and standing behind it, or do you think it's kind of queer washing in that sense?
I think that it's more like queer washing, honestly. I think that there are positives to when brands are like, here's our rainbow collection for June or whatever they do, because like you said, it might make those sort of garments accessible to people who can't afford it otherwise. It makes it more visible, but in a way it's almost like another sort of trend that gets hopped on for a minute and then moves away. It's like, that is done now, the rainbow display is out of the window and we have got the bikinis in or whatever. So I think that this sort of rainbow capitalism that comes around at the moment, every summer, every high street brand has their Pride t-shirts in the window. I don't think it's anything good, especially from my point of view. I've been researching lesbian and queer activist t-shirts, and so much of the time these clothing collections, their main feature is t-shirts, and the ones that I've looked at are ones that have been made and printed by hand, that have been done to represent a specific like Pride event or a specific community or a specific identity. And I think that's so much more important, and it's so much more powerful when people actually make it themselves or they get it from a local maker. So I think there are some positives to that, but I think on the whole, it's not necessarily a good thing. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Awesome. Any more? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were on. Sorry. So I just want to make a comment about like a brand, and, embracing diversity. And I think for me, I really trust a brand when I hear from the founder and when I hear their ethics and morals and what they stand for, and especially when it goes beyond the marketing messages. I work in marketing. Don't trust it. Don't trust it as well as I can throw it. But yeah, I also am really interested in the views of the founder, which goes beyond just the clothing industry, like wider issues, like Sancho's on Instagram. I think, in the next panel. But yeah, I love their Instagram and how they position everything. But also, I've got a question, because obviously diversity. I'm just wondering about like sustainable brands for plus sizes as well, because I have some friends and they say that they find it really difficult to buy second hand, which is ultimately like the best kind of sustainable way of getting clothes. And I do kind of struggle in kind of finding things, brands which like prioritise plus size. So I was just wondering if anyone has any brands to mind.
I mean, we could put it out to the
I
The
suppose.
lady behind you there.
There's a company called Big Sister Swap, which is quite cool, where you get some clothes you don't want, you donate it to them, they have a big warehouse where they collect them all, and then you tell them what your taste is, and they personally make a little wardrobe or collection for you and send it out.
That's
So
awesome.
they're really good for plus size, because as long as they're getting plus size things, it keeps everything in circulation on a really nice, like, even level.
Another one?
Yeah, I also just saw in London.
Yes.
They do a fantastic job of like pre-order. Like pre-order sizing t-shirt.
And another one?
I think when you're a small business and you're just started as an ethical business and stuff, it's always very hard to cater for all sizes because there's not demand. And this is something like, for running for 2-3 years, I got I think maybe 2 people asking me like, oh, do you do 4XL or 5XL kind of thing. So what I would say is like, for a consumer kind of thing, is to reach out to the brands and say like, hey, do you do this? Or can you please consider doing this as well? Because that's the thing, like whenever you're ordering any kind of volume of orders and stuff, it usually is like 6-7 size range that you normally factory takes in order. Anything additional, you have to pay extra money. So I think knowing that as well is quite useful. But we do underwear up to size 6XL after I think 2 years of like listening from feedback. But like you said, Sam, I think it's very important you message the brand that you would love to talk to, because they do read messages and do act on that.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I suppose I just want. Oh, sorry, no, I don't need to talk anymore. You go ahead.
It's just quite like amusing, because no one's talked about neurodiversity.
Okay.
And I have ADHD, and so when I'm like, right, my clothes basically need to be bomb-proof from Agent of Chaos. And I often find myself just looking in second-hand charity shops or projects and label board, because I was a professional seamstress for a bit. And then I just kind of like, I just feel like I wear the same things all the time, and then I see fashions, and obviously I'm not into fast fashion, but I'm like, I would like to feel a bit more trendy, and it's just not a thing that I can, it feels inaccessible to me.
Thank you for the comment. I mean, I always speak from my own experience, so my experience and understanding is kind of racial diversity, so that's why I focused on that, and I think it's very much something that needs to be considered, I suppose, opening up to thoughts, recommendations, ideas.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and to be totally honest, I haven't thought about it loads before, so I think that's why conversations like this are so good, and you raising the point, so thanks so much for...
Like charity shops, and maybe like you're looking like you're in hiking gear all the time. I don't want to
Yeah.
Like that.
I want to look a bit more like, I mean, I think I've done all right, but
Totally.
like, these people look great, and we especially want to be a part of that, and unless I like take the time to sew myself something, which doesn't happen. And then it just doesn't happen, so that's it.
And I think this leads to the point that was made earlier around the sustainable fashion, ethical fashion being a really small market at the moment, so it's only catering for a very...
Some of the design
exactly a very particular type of style
Yeah.
and choice, isn't it, at the moment? So as soon as that's more accessible,
Yeah.
like that's an easy thing to do, and there's more diversity in behind the scenes, that will hopefully change and shift. But at the moment, it is such a small.
Yeah.
Even if you're into fashion, I think there's a very particular type of style for the kind of big names in sustainable fashion. So I just don't think it caters for a lot of design choice generally, and that covers kind of your, exactly. Ellie, did you have anything to add?
No, I was just itching my eyebrow. Frankly.
On the
Yeah.
neurodiversity, it's really interesting that you raised that, and I've heard conversations recently with people who are autistic talking about labels. Yes,
Yeah.
so labels, where it gets too close up in your things that would just distract them beyond belief, so they couldn't then wear that garment. So I don't have anything to offer, just thanks for raising that in this space. Yeah. And I think there was a question.
Yes.
Here.
Yes.
So you've talked a little bit about accessibility from a price point perspective and cutting the middleman. So I was just kind of wondering, how do you ensure that your workers in your supply chain, so the people who make your clothes, are paid a living wage? Just
Yeah.
to compensate for that, obviously.
Yeah, great. Great question. So from a cotton perspective, we work with Fair Trade. So it's basically all about third-party certifications. So Fair Trade, we work with on cotton, who are kind of like, in terms of wages and working conditions, I think are kind of like the premium when it comes to cotton. And then from a factory perspective, we work with a factory in southern India, and the thing which I particularly wanted to work on was the wages issue, because it's a thing which it costs pennies to pay living wages in India for a t-shirt, whereas and I think loads of brands don't focus on it. And so we're part of a fair share scheme, which was a scheme developed to pay a little bit extra to the garment workers on every item we buy towards a living wage for them. And if that scheme can then get rolled out across the whole factory, we can do living wages for the whole factory. But because we're such a small player at the moment, we can't do it. But it was basically the only scheme I found in the industry which was actually increasing wages, because I don't know of another certification which actually goes, okay, we're actually paying living wages, even if a certification says it. I haven't found any proof that they actually do it.
Methodologies like the Anthem methodology, for instance.
Totally.
And, the
Yeah.
International wage and the European
Yeah.
methodology that you should use in supply chain.
Totally, and I think so the Living Wage Foundation in the UK, they've got a global living wage foundation as well, and so they're developing a model for working there, because there's different methodologies for living wages across the world. They have to go, okay, at the moment they're establishing a global secretariat to go, how can we agree on a methodology? Because that's some of the problems of big brands are going, yeah, but what is a living wage? And then, so I think the steps from their perspective are, we can set a methodology for working out a living wage, and then we can start to implement it. And we're kind of going, let's bypass that a little bit and go straight, just decide on what a living wage is, and so we can start increasing workers' wages right now. But for the global question, I think things like what the Global Living Wage Foundation is doing is really good.
Cool. Any other final questions? We've got a couple of minutes left. Oh, sorry. I'll go this side first and then that side.
For Sam, how do you hold yourself accountable? Is there like a question you ask yourself before you decide on a decision?
Oh, great question. Wow. How do I hold myself accountable? So there's a team who holds us accountable, and we've got investors who will also ask us questions or hold us accountable. And then I think personally, like if I'm making a decision for the business, I have to personally, I feel like this is not a great answer, but I have to personally be okay with it from my own conscience perspective and go, what is what we're doing good here, or is it not? Yeah.
Cool. I ask myself why 5 times to get behind things, and
Nice.
I think that brings you to the root of quite a lot of problems quite quickly.
Yeah.
Another question over there.
Yeah, I was just wondering, are you tracking your carbon footprint at the moment, reporting it in any way?
Yeah, so so the t-shirts use 90% less CO2 than conventional cotton t-shirts, and that was certified by the Carbon Trust. And then we're so small at the moment that we haven't done like an overall business look at our carbon footprint. We offset carbon from delivery. So we do that as well. But there'll be other things for us to look into, like website and that kind of thing as well.
Was there another hand, did I see? Just very quickly on that, I think carbon footprinting can be a slippery slope. What is it? Was it invented by BP or something? And it leads to that idea that it's an individual's responsibility. So I think, yes, there is value in it from a big brand's perspective because their carbon footprint, but I question the value of it on a smaller scale. And offsetting is a whole different story. We could talk about offsetting for an hour, but I won't go on to that one. The hand at the back.
Well, I have to come back to the $7.99 t-shirt, I'm afraid. Is the business model scalable?
I think it is, yeah. We based it on the fact that it should be scalable and that we do it on scale. And it only works on scale as well.
Okay, so you have said that you won't be doing any wholesale because you're cutting that margin and just calculating £3.50 for the cost of the t-shirt kind of thing.
Yeah.
Gives you £3.50.
Yeah. Which is why we've got to do it on scale.
Yeah, so I guess this is like almost like a hook so that people know that sustainable can be affordable. So you have other range coming at the lower price of that, or they're like a higher scale?
That's the plan, is to bring in more ranges. So the hoodies at the moment we're thinking of doing $29.99 is the plan. Coloured t-shirts $8.99, so £1 more. But our aim is to keep it as affordable as possible.
Bear in mind it's only a year, 2 years old?
We launched in April.
Exactly. So I think one t-shirt is okay for now. There was one more hand we've got time for.
I was just going to ask a question around how much thought planning you put towards the end life of items that you produce and sell as a company. Yeah, and whether you're thinking regarding consumers at some point are used, right? And so they'll either just remain on wall or they'll go away or recycle. Have you planned?
We haven't done a plan of we say on the garment label when you're done with your t-shirt, recycle it. I'm aware it's a huge impact of the life cycle of the garment is like the main carbon footprint, isn't it? When it comes over here and people are washing it, and so I think as we grow bigger, I think our long-term trajectory, we're looking more towards like a Patagonian model of like worn wear and repairing clothes and that kind of thing, and encouraging recycling. And if we were to do stores, how can we encourage recycling in stores? Or there's some great brands like where you can send your clothes back to them and they'll recycle them and work with it from that perspective. But totally honestly, we're early days on that kind of thing.
The reason I ask is because that for me, as a sustainable brand, like makes me question kind of, those 5 whys. The final one for me is, should I sell everything in here? The answer to that is the lifestyle management, personally.
Yeah.
But as a result of that, I've started a new company that facilitates that brand.
Cool.
Connections.
Nice.
Awesome, thank you very much. I think we're at just about time, so I just wanted to open it up to both you guys again, if there was any final thoughts you wanted to share on the kind of, I can't even remember what the broad topic was. What was it? Representation matters. There was a byline. Representation matters. Any final thoughts on that? Do we think it is currently? How do we get there? Yeah, just any final thoughts you want to share. Ellie first.
I just think that when we're thinking about representation, we need to think about so many different aspects. As we've found out through this discussion, you think maybe at first when it comes to representation of a few select groups, but there's so many different people who have different needs who need to be included and who need to be thought about within these discussions. So with representation, it's not just one thing, it's many people and many situations and many discussions to be had.
Awesome. And Sam?
I think I would just say, please message brands, like do it, because they do respond to that kind of thing, even if you don't get a personal response, if enough people do it.
Yeah, the power of people, I suppose,
Totally,
isn't it? Or
yeah.
the purpose of power. Brilliant. So I think that's us at about time. Yes, I'm getting nodded at. Thank you very much for sticking with us today for the hour. Thank you for your questions and critical thought and picking up on things that we've missed. That's really important. I hope you found it valuable. And I hope you stick around for the next session, which is looking particularly at bits in detail, and come again tomorrow, because we're looking, I'm doing another session that's particularly on kind of reuse and recycling, and within the sustainable fashion industry. So that's something that we've touched on that's really important. So yeah, have a great rest of your day, and thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much.